Hello, everyone. Carahsoft would like to welcome you to our Qmulos webinar. Carahsoft Technology is a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local agencies. Carahsoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors, including Qmulos, Splunk, AWS, Forescout, VMware, and Okta. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Igor Volovich, Vice President of Compliance Strategy at Qmulos, Drew Church, Staff Security Strategist at Splunk, and Norman St. Laurent, Federal Cisco Secure Product Manager at Cisco. Igor, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome to our panel. I'll give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves, talk about your role, what you guys do, and we'll kick it off that way. Let's start with Norman.
All right, hey everybody, Norman St. Laurent with Cisco. I'm the Federal Product Marketing Manager with Cisco. So I take all of our 31 Cisco Secure tools with our architecture, and I assist our federal customers with that, include DoD, IC, and all 72 federal agencies. That's me in a nutshell. I've been doing security for 35 years, ex-FBI, ex-NSA employee, ex-insider threat for the NITTF with the DNI. And the last 6 years I've been here with Cisco, loving it. So that's me.
Great. Well, thanks for being here, Norman. We look forward to hearing your perspective. Over to Drew.
Hey, everybody. My name is Drew Church. I'm a staff security strategist here at Splunk. I've been at Splunk since August of 2019. Before that, I was about a DON civilian for about 10 years. And my job is pretty much helping all of our public sector customers solve interesting security problems with our products and services. Compliance is kind of my thing. So anytime somebody from Qmulos says, hey, Drew, let's talk about compliance, I am all in.
Sounds great. Well, we always love having you, and thanks again for making time for us. All right, welcome, Drew. So my name is Igor Volovich. I'm the VP of Compliance Strategy here at Qmulos. Qmulos is a pioneering compliance automation company based in Virginia, or formerly based in Virginia. Now we're based everywhere. We're in your neighborhood too. And certainly we're all over the world when it comes to managing compliance, helping folks streamline their compliance, automation, and really extract value out of their compliance program in non-traditional ways. And so when we think about compliance, we think of compliance therapy. And this is why I'm wearing what I'm wearing and why I have that background, is because we are thinking about treating the whole problem, not just a symptom. We're looking at the root cause of why compliance programs have not delivered value to enterprises historically, and why we can revolutionize that and really move into the next generation of compliance management. And we'll talk about a lot of that today. So I wanted to kick off the discussion with this question. Why do you think we've historically separated compliance management and security operations into different silos? How come they've never really worked hand in hand, even though they operate on a lot of the same data? And I'll let you guys kind of suss that out, because I've got my own thoughts on that. No, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So number one, it's important to have factual, technical evidence, right? In the different silos that meet each other need to be able to share. I'll take Cisco's perspective, and for today's call, I was able to call Mark Whitner, who's in charge of our SOC, that's actually doing Cisco's compliance for CMMC for our federal customers. So as you can imagine, Cisco, 60,000 people, right? And we're a big organization, and we need to comply. We do business with the federal government. Not only do we sell things, but we have services, and we have CUI and SCI data because we deal with the government. So we actually have our tools, our next-gen firewalls, our secure workload, about 19 tools inside our SOC out of our 31 tools actively working in the background so that we can meet CMMC. And what we've done is we've taken Qmulos and Splunk to compliance to help us get compliant, right? So we're able to take Q compliance and have real factual information applied with our tools in the background. We're able to peek in, tunnel deep, and see what we meet and what we don't meet, and then fine tune. Right, so we have a great high-level bird's-eye view with Qmulos, and feeding the data to Splunk, and then be able to go back to our tools, tune them up, so that we get real factual information right out of the go.
Well, it's interesting that you said factual, right? So my personal view on this is that a lot of compliance programs, and in fact, security programs operate on opinion, not fact, right? And it's subjective, not objective. And that distinction, these are kind of big bucket things, right? But from my perspective, is a lot of the hands that get put on a lot of the data, by the time it gets to that dashboard, by the time that one single piece of data becomes a pixel on somebody's dashboard or somebody's chart or something, right? It's been through a lot of massaging, right? A lot of people have touched it. It probably came from asking somebody a question, right? Somebody calls somebody, they do what we call data call in compliance. And somebody says, oh yeah, I think this control is doing this, right? Then it goes to an analyst, then it goes to NSSO, then it goes to NSSM, and it goes through all these layers, right, to get to that. Well, basically, it's a pile of subjective opinion masquerading as fact, right? And so as we get further and further from that origin of that data, right, that initial data point, it feels like the trustworthiness of that data certainly attenuates with distance, right? And so once we get to that final report, well, how truthful is it, right? And so, Drew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, Splunk data is what you guys do, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny, right? You mentioned the massaging of the pixels, as it were. And I was just talking to all of our technical experts here at Splunk just a couple of weeks ago about compliance, particularly around the public sector. And I used the phrase gun decking, and I got some groans in the room, right? Where, I mean, somebody's making some stuff up, and that's where you get that opinion farming at scale that I've heard you talk about before. Quite frankly, spreadsheets suck, right? And so when we get lost in the weeds. Somebody ran a pivot table one time and somebody else took over the spreadsheet, and it just becomes this nightmare. And so going back to that, that technical evidence is really important, and thinking about that. I used to try and brief my leadership, right, as a former security operations center manager who had actually a number of compliance responsibilities, very much in the vulnerability management space, part of compliance. And I tried to brief him off of my Splunk dashboards, and like my boss, right, who's the ISSM, was like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, why? And he used the phrase, quote, too much truth. And I thought that was really interesting. And so breaking down those barriers and getting everyone to kind of accept, right, facts are facts, opinions are opinions. It requires some organizational change. And so working with people, understanding why and talking about compliance is more GRC compliance. They're not four-letter words, right? They're the reason why we do the things that we do. And I could talk for hours about how much cyber is enough. And so when we think about this from a Splunk perspective, right, it's like you've got all this massive amount of machine data. Do something with it. Do the cool compliance stuff. Make it fun, make it exciting, and bring some value to that. Because it can be used across the security operations team, across the IT operations team, and across the compliance function. And that's why it's, frankly, it's always awesome to get to work with Qmulos, because you are turning that particular part of the platform into something exciting and usable, much like we've done with our IT operations and security operations functions.
Indeed. Well, I really appreciate the great feedback from both you guys. And the fact is, that's kind of how we approached this whole model about a decade ago, right? Over a decade ago. We've been around for about 11 years now. People still think of us as a startup, a little engine that could, right? But we've been here for a long time. And we've built a lot of credibility in this industry by really trying to disrupt the existing models of compliance management, and compliance, really kind of innovating around compliance operations, really operationalizing compliance with technical evidence, right? And making sure that we automate the entire life cycle end to end. I think a lot of folks in this industry, especially, they become accustomed to kind of having a fancy UI for your basic spreadsheet, right? Or for your SQL database or something. The evolution in this space has been very stagnated, right? We really haven't done, I don't feel, enough honest to goodness evolving around this space, right? We've just kind of accepted the status quo. We just need to automate the way we fill out the forms, maybe do that a little faster. Maybe we pass the data around to different folks who are doing the work a little faster, make the hands move a little faster. But by and large, we've kind of accepted that this is the way compliance is meant to work. And it's kind of compliance for its own sake. Here's compliance, full stop, pivot, then we do security operations, pivot, then we do risk management. And all of these are different departments, different skill sets, different budgets, and different objectives, right? And incentives are drastically different. And I'm really curious about what you just mentioned, Drew, is the idea of it's too much truth, right? This idea that I don't want to know, the idea basically of plausible deniability, right? That's what it boils down to. And I think what we're seeing on the horizon now with the regulatory regime, SEC is releasing its new cyber rules in April. We just saw FTC release a bunch of new cyber rules. They're talking about, the enforcement climate of FTC obviously has been ratcheted up. So we've got all kinds of things moving around, right? We've got National Cybersecurity Strategy that's coming out. I mean, it's already come out, right? A lot of things are going to come out of that, like we saw with the Executive Order 14028. So I think the overarching kind of the banner on the Goodyear blimp above our head is accountability. And we're talking about personal accountability for corporate directors and executives. And I read an article actually this morning in Forbes, and they talked about the time of plausible compliance is gone. And it's going to be the biggest regulatory revolution since Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, basically. So we're talking about cyber ox, like cyber socks, right? That's what we're talking about. So I'm curious your thoughts on kind of if we can kind of go deeper into this question of accountability and truthfulness. How much can you trust the data that's in your compliance program today, understanding that a lot of it is subjective opinion, and like what are the outcomes? I mean, what do you do with once you know that? What do you do?
Yeah, let me jump in. I'm sure Norman's got some great stuff to say about that as well. Right, I was what was it, March 9th? So I guess we're talking 7 days ago. DoD CIO Mr. Sherman got in front of the House Armed Services Committee, HASC, and talked about this. Like they specifically talked about CMMC. And so you may be thinking CMMC is not going to happen, right? We're talking 7 days ago. The DoD CIO said, no, Congress, we're still very much doing this. And they're going through that rulemaking process. And so tying it back to CMMC and thinking about level 1, 2, and 3, level 1 is very basic. And there's a self-attestation, right? Like, hey, that's where we're still kind of thinking about plausible deniability. But when you start getting into levels 2 and 3, we're really focused on the 3 PAOs and that third-party assessment official. And I also think it's interesting, right, is that was one of the complaints about CMC 1.0, right, where folks were like, oh, I don't want the peek behind the curtain, and so it makes things a little bit more challenging. And so we can kind of like wail and gnash our teeth a bit on this, but the fundamental, right, is everyone's accepted the fact, almost everyone has accepted the fact, I should say, that we can't just do the spreadsheets. We can't just thinking about this from just put compliance in a corner and really do bring that data to the fray, right? Mm-hmm. So when we go back to some of those controls and we go back to some of the practices in CMMC that really go back to the basics in 800, 181 and 182, right? Observe, test, and interview folks, right? That's how we assess these things. And being able to do that at scale, being able to do that reliably, making sure that our assessors can have validation that what they're assessing is true, that all goes back to data. And so having that automated collection, being able to prove to the assessors that, in fact, we are doing the things that we said we did, those are all critical things. And I think it's interesting to note, particularly that DHS, they're thinking about this for critical infrastructure as well. I know we're talking about CMMC today, but I bet a lot of the players playing the same thing. They don't like the self-attestation inside of CMMC 2.0 because of just that, right? We can't trust everybody all the time. And so that era is over, and we need to be thinking about that and really using data and technology to solve that problem.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the idea that you have to know the truth, you can't hide behind the complexity and the personal accountability. I mean, somebody's going to sign off on that control. Somebody's going to sign off on that report, right? The audit report, the assessment report. It's somebody's name on that line. And when you put that your name on that dotted line, you have to wonder. Like before, you could say, well, we didn't know. We did the best we could, right? Here's a compliance report. We just got breached. I'm sorry, Senator, I have no recollection of blah, 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 right? That typical, that story, right? I just didn't know. Well, you're supposed to know. It's your job to know.
And that's why in CMC 2.0, right, the executive of the company is now signing off on that self-attestation at level 1, no longer just a random, I'll say, fall person, right? That's just like, hey, I was hired to sign the CMMC documentation, and then I have 20 clients. At some point, I've got some lawyer that's probably going to have to defend me in court somewhere. They're thinking about the chief executives, the leaders, the boards of directors, and saying, hey, no, this is your problem now, which hopefully will help us get away from that too much truth problem.
Yeah, it's definitely putting a lot more teeth into it. So I think this is a good time for our poll. And I think our first question is, what is your biggest challenge in achieving CMMC 2.0 compliance? And we'll have Alex put that up and our audience can vote on that. I'd love to hear their thoughts on that. So it's either lack of technical expertise in-house, difficulty in obtaining necessary documentation and evidence. We've talked about that, and limited budget for compliance activities, or anything else. Tell us what your thoughts are, and we'll give you a minute. And while you do that, we can kind of continue the conversation. So Norman, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, Cisco, huge vendor. We're seeing a lot of movement, especially after the National Cybersecurity Policy got published, or a strategy rather got published. The idea of shifting risk and shifting liability. I mean, they're calling specifically line item, right, in the strategy for legislation that places vendors like Cisco basically in jeopardy of liability, where you can no longer disclaim liability for faulty software. And we all know, look, nobody's immune from zero-day bugs, right? You know, software is not perfect. It'll never be perfect. So at some point, somebody who uses Cisco products will get breached, right? It'll happen. It's an eventuality. It's not something that, you know, you can definitely keep from happening. So at that point, you know, the traditional view is, well, that happened. Sorry, we'll do better next time. And now the government is saying, look, that's not good enough. We want you to actually not just demonstrate you're doing the right thing for these customers once you ship that software, but we want to know how you're getting to that. We want to know how you are actually creating those secure products. Show me your SDLC. Show me you're taking good care. You're doing your due diligence around these things to protect against this kind of systemic risk that we've been dealing with. So as a vendor, what are your thoughts on that? You know, what are you taking as your first initial steps and mapping this out? Kind of what's your roadmap to getting there?
Yeah, so that's great. So and there's a lot to that, right? We have 31 Cisco Secure products in our portfolio. I think we're ahead of Microsoft with the most security products out there. If not, we're neck and neck with producing, you know, security products, right? So there's a lot to that question, right? Of course, we want to follow things like common criteria, FedRAMP, and get all the certifications we can. And when we build, we definitely build that into the product, right, from the get-go. So we're starting with the secure baseline for all of our stuff and moving up and doing everything a good code writer should do when they're developing their code. That said, we're just, everybody, when you think of Cisco, right, you're thinking network, you're thinking router switch, right? And that's an important part, because our security tools, we want to turn that network into a sensor, right? So all of our route switch talk to our security tools. You know, one pane of glass now we're moving to, and we're talking getting that data in from a huge subset of things on the network, right? So that we can tell that whole story, right? But for CMMC, as an example, bringing in other tools like Splunk to kind of correlate all the data, right? All of our tools have APIs that can write the Splunk. But using things like Qmulos too during the CMMC assessment. And we talked about a spreadsheet a while back, and that just doesn't cut it, right? So, you know, we're really doing a gap analysis. That's what we're doing, right? We're seeing the current state of where we are in an ideal state of how we can meet CMMC, right? Highlighting our shortcomings and or opportunities for improvement. And so your question here on, you know, what is Cisco doing to write secure code? You know, we're going to be on the line to deliver secure code, all that stuff. That's on the forefront in our business units for each of our tools, right? We know that, and we go and we write towards it, right? We're just trying to meet that as the best we can, and we do. But you know, things like a firewall, next gen firewall, it doesn't get shipped to you with your configuration file in it, right? It doesn't get shipped with you securing your network. That box gets shipped out, and we have deployment guides and all that other stuff. So it's going to take services and a myriad of people, right? When we're looking at CMMC level 2 advanced and expert levels with the NIST 800 series, you know, 110 practices and 110 plus more at the expert level, it's not an easy thing. Preparing for CMMC certification requires a strategic approach, and it's a resource commitment to enhance, you know, to meet the CMMC stuff. It's definitely, you're all in to meet this.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think when it comes to a roadmap towards any kind of compliance mandate, but especially CMMC, I mean, the danger or the jeopardy with CMMC is it hits you in the P&L, right? You know, if you can't actually demonstrate compliance and you are at the level where you have to, right? And it can't just be self-certification, it can't be self-assessment, where you actually have to, well, pay somebody to come in and validate this. Just getting to that point is hard enough, right? And getting there with integrity is hard enough, right? Knowing that truth, as Drew was talking about, like it's too much truth. I don't want to know. Well, now you have to know, right? You can't hide behind it, right? The complexity is no longer a good shield. But I mean, it never wore, but it kind of worked. I mean, for a long time, people kind of got away with it, right? But today we're talking about real impact to your revenue, right? If you can't demonstrate compliance, you literally cannot bid on a federal contract. And that's real. That's got teeth, right? So that starts happening. That has a cascading effect, right? VPs get fired, then senior VPs get fired, and on it goes. And then shareholders start asking big questions. Well, how come we missed our revenue number for last quarter or last year? Or how come our projections are off and now our stock has tanked, right? So this becomes a lot more tangible. It's no longer theoretical. We saw 10 years ago, 15 years ago, TJ Maxx gets breached, and everybody kind of watches with their bated breath, thinking like, okay, maybe their stock will tank, and that will finally get people to think in the boardroom, okay, cybersecurity is real. And then nothing happened. People went back to shopping there because the risk was transferred. They didn't hold any of that risk. Well, now, basically what the federal government is saying, look, we get it. The market hasn't responded. It hasn't figured out a way to accurately price cybersecurity risk into either the share of stock or your overall posture in the market. Like security is not a competitive advantage. So we're going to make it so. We will literally come in and intervene into the market forces and create those kinds of incentives, which, look, if you take kind of an economic interventionist view, maybe that's a positive thing. But, and if you take more kind of a Milton Friedman approach, you say, hey, let the market figure it out. Well, the market hasn't, right? Either the consumers, definitely the consumers have not become sophisticated enough. The retail investor has not become sophisticated enough. Even the institutional investor is not pricing this correctly. I mean, what we are seeing is people whose business is absolutely to be experts at risk, insurance companies. The Zurich insurance CEO just said, reinsurance for cyber is an impossibility. Like, we're exiting that market. We've seen a lot of people exit the market at the retail level also. Like, you can't even get a ransomware policy right now for a decent cost, right? People don't want to be in that business. So you've got insurers at the retail level exiting. You've got reinsurance companies like Zurich exiting. This is just this nebulous thing that nobody can put their hands around. It's like trying to hug Jello, right? So I mean, do I agree that we needed something? Absolutely. Do I think it's government intervention? Well, that's where we are now, right? We've gotten here because the market hasn't been able to respond. And so you've got accountability, you've got real hit to the P&L possibly, right? And you have to demonstrate that you're doing the right thing with integrity, and you have to show data. Like, it's no longer like, hey, show me how you got to it. No, we want to know, show me the work, like open up the books and do it, right? And I think the other thing that's interesting for me, and I'd love to hear from you guys on this, is the importance of future-proofing your compliance management program, right? Because CMMC is one thing, but there's going to be a lot more mandates coming out. We saw what happened with Executive Order 14028. Boom, here comes OMB Memorandum M2131. And now everybody's freaking out, how am I going to get to it, right? We're already at level 1. We're going to have to get to EL2 pretty soon. So these things will keep coming out, right? If you are still struggling to get to any kind of a compliance posture or demonstrate any kind of compliance posture at scale, with integrity, at the speed that you're required to, you're out to lunch. I mean, this becomes a competitive disadvantage, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to flip the competitive disadvantage on its head a bit, because you're right. But I also want to think about this from a, dare I say, digital resilience perspective, right? Because the hit to the P&L, right, isn't just, hey, well, if you can't bid on the contract, right, and recompete. I mentioned, compliance should be a 4-letter word, but like recompete, that's kind of the 4-letter word. Nobody likes going through that. So that's one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin is, right, the compliance is a thing that you do so that you can withstand, right? Go look back to the definition of this, right? So that you can withstand and recover from that hit. And so by being compliant, right, so that if there is a ransomware outbreak, there is business email compromise, there is some kind of advanced threat actor, which applies very clearly to the defense industrial base, right? Like, you want to be able to withstand that attack, not just so that you can continue to bid on contracts, but so that the contracts that you currently have, you can keep, right? And then you even can grow into that, right? And you asked the question about how do you future-proof your compliance strategy, and what are you thinking about, right? Is as that stuff comes out, right? Offerings that, right? You ingest that data, you take that data, and then you use it and look at it from no matter what lens, right? Whether it's a CMMC lens, whether you're going and bidding on something else that has some kind of RMF requirement, you're handling other kinds of CUI or even classified data, and you're thinking about, hey, I need to move into the cloud and FedRAMP and all this stuff, right? No matter, and heaven forbid you take credit cards and you have PCI DSS in the mix, right? Like, a log is a log, a piece of data, the network sensors, going back to what Norman said about turning route switch into sensors, right? All of this information, you grab it, grab a hold of it, and then use it no matter what perspective, what lens, what pillar, or what newfangled thing comes out. And that's how I think, and I think we at Splunk think about this from a future-proofing perspective.
That's really insightful.
Yeah, you need to grab.
Yeah, go ahead, Laurent.
I was going to say you need to grab everything you can too, right? Because it's hard to know what CMMC data is. I mean, what is FCI, right? And all these different vendors out there are people working with the DoD and government. What is controlled unclassified information? Like, what is that, right? The definitions aren't that clear, right? Is a host name, is a username considered CUI? What about an IP address, right? Clear answers are very hard to find on what all this stuff is, what exactly is CUI. And with all the different vendors and everything, every different mission that they could be involved in, right? It's hard. It's going to be hard to define everything. So you got to grab everything you can and sort it out that way.
Hey,
Yeah,
guys,
I think I really like what you said
wanted to
about
interject.
network as a sensor.
we have a couple questions.
Oh, yeah,
You
go
guys
ahead.
were- All right, so this first one is for Norman. I think it goes back for when you were speaking a little bit ago, but it says, how does Cisco meet the DFAR 7012 requirements for FedRAMP equivalency?
Okay, so right now, like with our umbrella product, we're gonna that'll be FedRAMP and that'll be out. I don't know quite how to answer that question because I don't know that specific requirement on the top of my head. We do. You can go to cisco.com or you can Google and see everything we have FedRAMP, all our products that way. And I know that's not a very good answer, but like our SD-WAN FedRAMP or umbrella, our SIG product is there right now. We get a sponsor and that'll be turned on here shortly. So that's where we sit there. I hope I answered that good. I don't know that regulation very deep. I can back up a little bit and let you know what Cisco's doing internally. So we get hit by frameworks, by things like CMMC, NIST, this NIST security framework. In fact, I was just called with our European team for NIST 2, which is their big European framework that they need to meet over there. So what we've done internally is Cisco has a relational database that we've put together, and we've gone through every, like NIST 800-53, CMMC, CIS version 2, and we've mapped all of our Cisco Secure products with the business units and are able to go to each control and say whether this can do it or can't do it. And we're very, very methodical about it. We have always 3+ engineers on the phone so we can talk about what the control is that we're looking at, because people can read things differently. And we've gone in and mapped all of our stuff so that if somebody wants to know if our ICE products or if our next generation firewall meets CMMC, we can pull everything that it's mapped to on that. I hope that's a good answer. I apologize for not knowing on the far that you said off the top of my head.
Thanks, Norman. And then we have one more question here that says, do you think an unintended consequence from this is that the government will risk driving away new competition / fresh perspective, and as a result, sacrifice innovation by forcing this upfront investment for compliance? Will only the big federal integrators have the money to invest CMMC?
Yeah, so I can give you a part of the answer on that. Yeah, I think the conversation that I've seen in the CMMC community, yeah, there's a concern about that, right? So it's not a moot point. I think there's a concern about also consolidation being maybe driven into the marketplace, where smaller firms feel they need to basically go buddy up to a bigger firm and even be absorbed by them in order to manage those costs. Now, we haven't seen the real estimation of what the cost for a compliance program from under CMMC 2.0 will be. I mean, there's been some estimates, but we also, at this point, we don't even know how many firms are going to be subject to it, right? We have the numbers range from 80,000 through 300,000 members of the DIB that come within the sphere of CMMC 2.0 compliance. So at this stage, we don't even know that, right? So I think as we start moving through this, there is a commitment, at least we've heard the commitment from the DoD and DIBCAC, that they will apply kind of a tiered approach, right? And not everybody's going to be held to the same standard. Obviously, it's all about maintaining, level understanding of what is your actual exposure, where do you have FCI, where do you have CUI, I've heard stories of enclaves, right? People have talked about like having a COI or an FCI enclave. Kind of brings back some stories from the PCI DSS early days. Like we'll just have an enclave, and then everything else doesn't matter, right? It's not going to be quite that same way, I don't think. But there'll be ways to figure it out, right? There'll be ways to manage your exposure at any level. I mean, if you're Lockheed Martin, if you're a mom and pop making bolts for something that winds up in some defense apparatus, right? It won't be the same. At least we've had that commitment so far, but will it drive some folks to look at compliance as a barrier to entry? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I don't know if somebody would really look at it and go, look, we got to pay $300,000 for a compliance program, and we make $5 million a year, and this is just cost prohibitive. You've just eaten up our entire margin, and there's nothing we can do. Now, we also have heard conversations about including the cost of compliance programs in the actual cost of the contract. Right. So it becomes part of your bidding process, and it's actually something that's allowed to be claimed as a cost of providing that service or that product to the government. So that's also a conversation. So I don't have a concrete answer, but it's a valid question. And I think it's on everybody's mind.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts on that too. And I don't have a concrete answer, but I can tell you our CMMC internal teams and the meetings that I'm a part of here at Cisco, number one thing we talked about is, if you get the expert level, will you be winning more contracts than somebody that has an advanced? Do you really want to shoot for the higher level? That's number one. And then number two is we've talked about internally that we think that the government is going to have to allow for price cost, right? So you're going to be able to put in your billing the government, for whatever, a person or whatever, you're going to be able to charge more because you have to get this new CMMC certification, and it takes a full commitment, like we said before, and it's going to be expensive for some companies. But we think the only way that this is going to work, and this is not Cisco saying this is just us talking internally, the CMMC team, is that the government's going to have to allow the CMMC certified person to put that into the bill to the cost. So
yeah. So I think that's a great perspective, Norman. And I agree a lot with what you said. Today, actually, before the webinar, I had the opportunity to go meet with CISA, specifically JCDC, and we were talking about this kind of stuff. And something kind of comes to mind, right? Building the concepts and the cost of doing business. And there was a question posed about vulnerabilities and, hey, should we stop beating the drum because you're never going to solve the problem around vulnerabilities? And the answer is no, because we're not doing that yet. A good friend of mine and colleague, Mick, likes to talk about eating your cyber vegetables. And we're not doing that. And so I want to bring that to the concept of innovation and stifling this, and I appreciate JP. Haven't seen in a while, buddy. Good to hear from you. But fundamentally, right, my father's a small business owner. He works in the he doesn't support the DIB, but he definitely supports critical infrastructure. And there's a cost of doing business, right? Anybody that wants to start a business in this country, if they have a physical storefront, there's going to be fire alarms, there's going to be sprinkler systems in certain spaces, there's going to be all of these things that you have to do, the cost of doing business. And so unfortunately, as we lean on technology, we can't, right? That cost is shifting, right? So maybe we don't have physical storefronts anymore, or maybe we don't have this right, this office space where we're gates, guards, and guns from a physical perspective, if we bring it back to CMMC a bit. But you still have to do those things, and that threat isn't, the government's not doing this just because the government wants to exert control, right? The threat is actually real, right? Business email compromise is like a massive, what I can't even know how many billions of dollars are lost annually to business email compromise. And then just think about the effect it has on the defense industrial base and the controlled unclassified information. I think the way innovation really will happen in the future around this is going to be stop not innovating on controlled unclassified information, right? So much of this, the innovation and techniques and whatnot, don't require the processing of government information to do. And by the time you get to that point, you're probably a much larger business, or you've then, going back to what you're saying, Norman, about bringing in that cost of bidding on that contract, that will be an allowable cost. Hey, we've got this really cool technology or this thing we want to do, but now to use it against CUI, we need this other stuff, and we bid that into our contract appropriately. I'm not saying it's the right answer, but I think we have to stop thinking about this as an added cost and just thinking about, as we shift into a digital landscape, that's just the cost of doing business. But I recognize I'm sitting in a Splunk office saying that, and I speak from a position of privilege.
I mean, it sounds like what you guys are saying is if you're small enough where this can be cost prohibitive and an actual barrier to entry and innovation, then you're probably too small where this matters at that level, right? You're probably too small, right? When you start getting into, CMMC 2.0, more advanced controls, and you start getting to level 3, and now you've got DIPCAC on board, then we're talking to Cisco, we're talking to Lockheed, we're talking to Raytheon, right? We're not talking mom and pop or your dad's business, whatever they manufacture, right? It's not like that, right? So, and I think the DoD recognizes that. I think the community is aware of that. We're not necessarily expecting for, the big hammer of CMMC 2.0 to come down on small business. That's not the objective. The objective is really to deal with systemic risk. And we saw a lot of that language in the National Cyber Strategy that just got published. They're talking about really not so much just shifting risk, but really making sure that everybody's got skin in the game, right? If that's the operative concept that I think ties it all together, to me, that's what it sounds like. It's about systemic risk, recognizing that all of these things are intertwined. There's a lot of interdimensional kind of these, cross-connected cascading risk models. And I think we finally woke up to the fact that we can't just rely on people doing the good thing, doing the right thing at the right time, being good digital citizens, and doing it out of the goodness of their heart. Ultimately, compliance is about ensuring that you're doing the right thing at the right time and doing it to a standard. Let's also remember, let's peel the onion back a little bit more. What is compliance about? How do we come up with these frameworks and standards? They're not there for their own purpose, right? We came up, PCI DSS, great example. How did that come to be, right? Well, MasterCard and Visa got together and said, okay, this is how we keep getting our card information breached. There are common patterns to these threats. Let's organize them. These are the controls that seem to work against them. And let's go ahead and let everybody be on the same page, right? Same story for everything else. CMMC 2.0 is no different. We know there are common patterns. We know what the data is about. We know how to protect it. These are the controls. Go ahead and use them, right? Folks tend to focus on compliance as its own function, and incentives kind of become, well, we just got to get us past the audit, right? And my sense is, and I think I posed the question early on when we just started the conversation, and I wanted to go back to that for a second, how come we're not using compliance for actual operational risk management? And I think the big answer is because we're accepted compliance as this retroactive historical reporting function. We're always doing compliance in the past. We're capturing past state. Here's the idea of you do security, compliance is how you prove that you're doing it. Well, to be a little more nuanced and put a finer point on that, I think compliance is how we've been showing that we maybe did it, right? We're always capturing that, past state. Now, automation, this is where I think that's where automation has a lot of value. Qmulos came to be not because we wanted to play with Splunk and be great partners and do some interesting stuff. And hey, here's a cute, cool UI, and here's a great platform where you don't have to do so many data calls and you don't have to go and push data into a spreadsheet. It wasn't really about that. It's because we recognize the critical importance, the strategic importance of bringing compliance into the real time now and placing it on the same time scale as the security operations folks enjoy, right? I mean, you would never expect to do SOC work based on 3-year-old data, or even 3-week-old data. You want it real time now. That's what Splunk delivers, right? So for us, the reason we went with Splunk is because we wanted to have access to, well, as Laurent put it, right, network as a sensor. And I used to say everything's a sensor, right? And I think that's a, from Cisco's perspective, of course, network is a sensor, right? Anything is a source of telemetry. Anything is a data point. As long as you can make sense of it from a control perspective, well, guess what? You're doing compliance and security at the same time. The only problem is you haven't been doing compliance in real time. And now you can, because automation makes it possible, right? Splunk makes it possible. Looking at everything in your environment as a data source, that's what makes it possible. That's what ties it all together. So that's kind of my view of it. And I think there's a lot of power there, right? A lot of hidden value in your existing compliance programs out there that is just not being recognized. People sort of, push folks into those skill sets. They're chiefly administrative functions, a lot of manual overhead, a lot of that data collection, data munging, data massaging effort that's going on. Reporting, how many spreadsheets and how many PowerPoints get produced, right? You talked about pivot tables, that's the advanced thing in compliance management. We're trying to really elevate ourselves to the same level that we've enjoyed in security operations for the last 20 years. All that progress that's gotten to making security better, easier, more friendly, less friction based, all of that, where has it been in compliance, right? Largely non-existent, right? So I think recognizing that there's this huge gap that we need to fill And with the huge focus on compliance now coming out of every angle, I mean, FTC, SEC, DHS, DOD, et cetera, right? I mean, everybody wants to know where you are. They want to know where your compliance posture is. And they want it now. They want it real time. They don't want to report from 2 years ago sitting in some congressional committee after the next breach, right? You know, the Colonial Pipeline. That was hard to watch for me. Like, I mean, hashtag cringe, right? Like, just, hey, here's a compliance report. We're compliant. When was that? A year ago, 6 months ago? Nobody cares, right? Where were you yesterday? Where are you today? Because the bad guys are operating in the now, right? So that's kind of my big spiel on that. I'd love to take a moment now and do another poll question for the audience. And the question is, how confident are you in your organization's ability to achieve and maintain compliance with the CMMC 2.0 framework? So really the question goes to sustainability. You know, once you've gotten there, how do you know you're keeping compliant? You're staying compliant. Those controls are still doing what you thought they were doing when you last checked them. And I think it also goes to the question of scale. Can you maintain that scale? You know, we know the reality for a lot of federal environments, they can only touch a control once every 3 years. That's so you look, anytime you look, that trailing time horizon is 3 years, right? Is there any value? Probably not. So we'll let the audience dig into these questions a little bit, and then let's continue the conversation. So what I just said, what are you guys' thoughts on that? You know, the idea of automation is really the catalyst for bringing compliance into real time and really converging. What I talk about a lot is convergence, and the idea of converging security operations, risk management, compliance management into kind of one unified force, right, for good.
Yeah. So go for it, Norman.
Yeah. So real quick, I mean, you know, Cisco delivering real-time security and risk management, Cisco honestly believes is benefited by having an integrated networking and security portfolio approach, right? Integrating everything as we said, right? And by having this integrated networking security portfolio, so the security tools all talk with the network talks with the security tools, bringing in as much data as you can, right? It's going to reduce procurement efforts, right? It's going to reduce integrity complexity. It's going to reduce internal preparation efforts for accreditations, such as CMMC, and it's going to reduce duration of accreditation, audit time, and activities, right? When you're being able to pull multiple data sources in, right, and then tell a story from it. And then at the end of the day, it's going to reduce the probability of a malicious breach, right? Because you're being able to tell a big story.
Yeah, and Norman, you're totally right. And when I kind of like pull out from that, I want to go back the comment about, hey, security work and compliance work, they're siloed out. And I'm a huge fan of a book that used to be called the 10 top 10 strategies of world-class cybersecurity operations center, and now it's the top 11, and it's put out by MITRE, and this book is free. You can go look it up. It's a fantastic resource, and I was like, hey, I had not looked specifically about compliance in that since the last time I read it, but when it was the 10 strategies. And in the latest and greatest, right, like compliance is a partner organization, right? The information system continuous monitoring plan and the ISSO and ISSM roles are not included in what they define as the SOC. And I think that's a miss, right? And I'm not calling out MITRE, and I'm not calling out the authors of that report, some really talented, smart people, in many cases much smarter than I am. But I think that when we define those roles as outside of the security team, we do ourselves and them a disservice, right? As a guy who kind of straddled the line between compliance and security operations and IT operations, quite frankly, we were a massive customer. I worked for the United States Navy, and our entire route switch was a backbone of a Nexus, and I'm going to tell you, I solved a lot of problems on that infrastructure because, right, not that the infrastructure is the problem. Cisco ships you with no config, right? What you do how you use the technology is where the problems come in. It's very infrequent that the technology itself is the problem. And by having all of this data I had that I was trying to collect from a compliance standpoint, because somebody told me I had to, I solved a ton of availability problems. Somebody would try and tell me, oh, hey, yeah, no, this VLAN ACL, it's good. There's no problems. I'm like, except I can show you the audit log from the AAA, right, from ISE, right, where the audit, hey, this person logged in at this time and made this change. I can now see all of the tracking is blocking. And somebody's like, well, hey, you're the compliance guy. Why are you getting in the middle of operations? Like, well, we can work together very well there, is I can show you in real time where the problems are that impacts availability, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that CIA triad, right? It's super important. And compliance really, by bringing that into the forefront, into the real time, gives them an equal seat at the table. And I think everyone will work a little bit better that way, right? I'm not setting this configuration baseline that is very restrictive and may actually cause problems because the compliance people told me to. But when they think back as to why we set those controls and trying to really protect ourselves, everything works much better together. And my last anecdote on that, right, is, as I mentioned, a Navy guy, I'm a Navy reservist as well. And I'd always get challenged, how much is enough cyber? Right? Igor, you talked about actuaries in the insurance industry, right? And how much is enough cyber? And that's what compliance gives us. It is by doing the hard work of saying, this is the types of data, these are the types of systems, et cetera. You have the amount of information, right? It's very similar to how somebody came up with the CWIS system, right? Those little R2D2 robots on surface ships, right? Like somebody had to come up with a calculation that said how much ammunition should be in the CWIS platform. Full stop, right? Okay, well, that's because that is the last line of defense in a long series of defensive things, right? But somebody did that work and everybody in the process agreed, or at least came to some kind of consensus. And we need to be doing that with our compliance data, with our security operations, with our IT operations teams, and really driving and ensuring that, remember, because we're not the profit centers for these commercial businesses, we're the cost centers, making sure that this is all in service of that P&L, that tighter integration. You can't lose. The more you silo it, the more you put in that retrospective, it just gets worse. And we got to do better for our customers. We got to do better for the taxpayers. And I think it's really important.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Norman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just another thought process on that. I mean, my understanding talking with the CMMC team at Cisco is CMMC is pass or fail. Right, like unlike FedRAMP that allows cloud service providers to submit improvement plans, POAMs, but while they're becoming authorized, right? CMMC is only going to allow low impact controls to be remediated after the audit, right? So this is a big hard thing for people, right? They're going to have the right tools in place to get compliant fast. So it's a commitment, right? Organizations that fail CMMC are going to be non-compliant, and they're not going to be able to do business with the DoD until they are compliant. So it's a big, it's a huge undertaking.
Indeed. Well, I think that brings us to a closing polling question. Question number 3, what area of CMMC 2.0 compliance do you believe could benefit most from automation and technical solutions? Is it access control, incident response, audit and accountability, or configuration management? And I think that's a trick question, honestly, because I think it's all of those. But honestly, I think automation is great. We actually have a question coming in right now, so I'll pose that to our panel. How best can organizations leverage automation to simplify their CMMC compliance process? And I'll take the first stab at it. I mean, I think we've talked about automation to a large degree here, and I think it's not just CMMC, right? The topic is CMMC, and I think because of the accountability and because of the lack of that plausible deniability that's being made available, I think Norman brings a great point. Also, the POAMs, right? Being able to just kind of kick that can down the road, and really kicking the can down the road towards taxpayers, right? Because ultimately we're the ones holding the bag for any breach of FCI or CUI in these environments, right? We're talking about our defense industry. We're talking about national security ultimately, and so when you hold that POAM open and just kind of keep, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, and then another audit cycle goes by and nothing happens. I think that's also being recognized. It's certainly being recognized by DIPCAC, and so that's not an option anymore, right? So a lot of this scrutiny is going to happen, and it's got a lot of teeth, and it's got a lot of problems if you don't do it right. And so I think, to me, automation, if you don't leverage it as early as possible, if you don't do it now for your CMMC compliance program, I think you'll find yourself up against it pretty quick. Throwing an army of ISSOs at it, it's not going to solve it. You will have to get to scale. You have to get to scale at real time, and you will have to do this on an ongoing basis. This is not going to be, let's just get to that compliance state and then everybody washes hands and takes a break for a while. This is going to be a constant pressure, right? And when your competitors are getting there faster, and you're showing up on that bid, on that recompete, and they're CMMC 2.0 compliant and you're not, And all you have to show is, hey, we promised to get there. Just trust us, guys. We'll get there soon. They will not even be able, they won't even be able to accept that in the bidding process, right? So it becomes a point of competitive advantage. It becomes a point of competitive necessity. It's table stakes, right? It's not a nice to have. And so the climate is changing, it's shifting. And I think, to me, automation, how do you do without it? I cannot imagine running a compliance program right now at any level, but especially at the level of level 3 of CMMC 2.0, major defense contractor, major system integrator, and you don't have automation on board. Good luck. I mean, I would be probably looking for my next job at that point.
Yeah. So the way I kind of think about this, where automation plays a role, is going back to that last job. We had this thing called the main asset list, or the MAL for short. And what this did was we took the underlying question, right? When you're thinking about what the CMMC assessment process is going to be, right? And we weren't against this CMMC, but we did have an authorization boundary under RMF. And right, what are you assessing? Like, what's actually on your network? And right, going back to Norman's point about the sensors, the network as a sensor, right? That was one of our inputs. We had essentially a 3-phase Venn diagram, right? Like, what do we think we have, right? And that's where our paperwork is. That's our spreadsheets. What does the network think we have, right? That's that technical evidence, right? And then what do we account for in our CMDB, right? And then bringing that all together, and we did some amazing stuff with that, right? Where we were able to say, okay, well, we thought we had this, and these other two teams, right? We're able to close those gaps much more rapidly. But I think more importantly than just closing the compliance gap, we actually drove some really positive outcomes, right? Compliance without outcomes is useless, but we drove those outcomes. Like, we were able to identify, hey, there were a couple of hosts, for example, in this one OU that weren't getting the correct configuration compliance, right? Because somebody had left them off of the wrong thing. And we were able to go in and look and say, oh my gosh, hey, these things are unprotected in all of the very stringent, these things were wide open, right? Now, fortunately, we're multiple layers deep, but by thinking about this and actually driving and using automation in how we think about compliance data, right? We were able to say, hey, we had registered these systems on our ATO, but we're not tracking them properly, and they weren't secured properly, right? So ensured positive outcomes. We ensured that we were actually maintaining and could give confidence to our authorizing official that we're doing the right things. And I think that's where automation comes into play, right? You can't be doing that data like bringing 3 spreadsheets together with a bunch of VLOOKUPs, like, forget it, right? Automation is the future.
Agreed. Norman?
Yeah, and just to clarify, right? When we say network as a sensor, right? Everybody's going to say, route switch, in your firewall, right? And grabbing NetFlow data from your route switch is important, right? Tools like our SNA or previously known as StealthWatch, right? Bringing that NetFlow in, but we're also talking the endpoint. When Cisco says network, we're talking the endpoint, right? We're talking things like our AnyConnect or secure email, right? Or secure web servers. We're talking the whole network, right? And even down to the person. So, even we could talk all day if we shift gears into zero trust. But one last thing too with CMMC and the risk for organizations, it's really about the supply chain as well, right? One of the goals of CMMC is to protect DoD supply chains from reducing risk from cybersecurity threats, and it even goes further, helping to address the impact of foreign adversaries and shell companies from impacting supply lines. So CMMC is it's important, and I really look forward to your question 3 and see where people categorize what's important there. I can't wait to see the outcome of that.
Absolutely.
It's an interesting question, right? Makes me think.
Yeah. I'm definitely curious about that myself. And I mean, I'd love to see a lot more polling happening just across the industry to really understand what folks believe they're struggling with. I mean, these are the reasons, this is the reason we have these kinds of conversations, because we're trying to get into the mind of the eventual consumer of this, right? This is the enterprise question, of the day. How do you deal with it? What do you think is going to be the biggest obstacle? And what do you think vendors like us can help? And this is not really about product pushing, right? It's about thinking about rethinking the value of compliance and really understanding that it's more than just this cost function, and we get it, right? You know, a lot of security is also it's a cost center, right? It's not really, it's never been a value generator. At least it's never been seen that way. When we start talking about things like, well, cash flow, and even if you want to put a finer point on that, you know, I had this conversation years ago with a large environment that I was managing, and the idea of cash flow velocity, like that was a big metric that we were judged by. And, you know, how quickly can we get on those deals? Not just how many deals are in the pipeline, but how quickly can we close them? And when it emerged, when we did a study, we realized that we weren't closing them fast enough because we couldn't demonstrate our compliance. It wasn't easy. You know, somebody was pulling up spreadsheets, we're pulling, you know, getting in external firms, you know, the Deloittes, the Booz Allens of the world to do an assessment for us and produce some kind of certificate. And this is, you know, over a decade ago, where it was perfectly acceptable to capture a past state and demonstrate that as, you know, here, we're doing the right thing, we're fine. Because ultimately, that entire systemic risk chain, right, wasn't really being recognized. Folks didn't really care that, you know, you were giving them data from a year ago. As long as we, you know, check the box, past that gate, we're fine, right? We can do business. And everybody kind of looked at it as, ugh, this is another thing that we have to do right now. Well, that's not the deal anymore, right? Especially with all the enforcement action that's coming out of the federal government and the regulatory agencies. And now the market is just coming to realize, hey, I don't want to know what happened a year ago. I want to know what's happening now, because guess what? That's going to bleed into my risk model. And I got to know that. And that's when we talk about the software supply chain and any kind of supply chain, especially within the DIPCAC, you know, context and the CMMC 2.0 context. That's what it's about. We're trying to merge all those different spheres of risk and these cascading risk models into really one, and have a better way to manage it at scale. And the way to do it is really to propagate these requirements across the board and get to as close to real time as possible. And I cannot imagine being able to do that at any kind of scale by hand. You just can't move your hands fast enough. And look, here's another idea, and I'd probably, maybe that's a good closing conversation. Closing topic is the idea that the threats keep escalating, geometric proportion, right? You know, and yet our ability to deal with them scales linearly, right? We can only, you know, hire 10 more people, 50 more people, 100 more people, maybe, right? So, and our budgets are scaling very, very, very slowly. The bad guys, tradecraft keeps escalating. It keeps scaling. You know, ransomware as a service. You know, everything's pretty much as a service. You can go get anything online. You don't have to write code. You don't have to do anything. You just have to swipe a credit card that you probably stole somewhere, you know, but 15 minutes ago, and then you're in business, right? Now you're hacking. Now you're doing ransom and all kind of stuff. So that's our reality, and yet we're still fighting this battle with both hands tied behind our back, right? So again, to me, the answer is, of course, automation. But I'd love to hear your guys' closing thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can close quite simply. But you know, Cisco, we're going through this, right? I mean, we've got to comply to CMMC, and we've offered services to help other people because we've taken our lessons learned, and we want to help. And we eat our own dog food, of course. We use all of our own Cisco security tools on the back end, but we're here to help. And we know that all of our products don't cover everything, and people run different products, right? So we've built teams in Cisco to help people get through this, no matter what they're using, right? No matter what's on their back end. And we can't do it without other vendors as well, right? Like Q Compliance and Qmulos and Splunk running. So it's a team effort, and Cisco, we've put in place mechanisms to get in touch with Cisco, and we're here to help. So we have teams that can go out and help you get complied.
Awesome. And from my perspective here at Splunk, right, we have, and this kind of helps answer the question that Allison asked in the Q&A as well. Fundamentally, right, automation is the game changer, right? Automation takes a lot of different worlds, but like we're talking about automation in the compliance world, we're going from spreadsheets to live reports. Automation, like the SOAR context, right, where we're talking about orchestration and automated response for security operations, that also plays a role. Hey, when we start having real-time data and real-time picture, for example, about vulnerabilities, right? What if you're able to then take action with other tools and technology to remediate them? For a perfect example, and I talk to customers about this all the time, about the importance of automation for their compliance posture, is actually like, hey, if your POAM says, hey, like, I put these things in the remediation VLAN. I legitimately like taking this vulnerability scan, bringing it into Splunk, pitching it off to the automation engine saying, hey, Cisco ISC, I want you to quarantine this host. Oh, they're not on the network. All right, we need to go kick it over to this. So any connect can start gathering this data, can start performing remediation actions, right? And so that's where the power comes to play. You're more secure, you're more compliant. And at the end of the day, you've actually kind of done less, and you don't have that army of ISSOs, as Igor so eloquently put it, trying to like track down the laptop that isn't quite compliant enough yet.
Indeed, indeed. And I appreciate your guys' input, and this has been great. I'll leave us with a closing thought from none other than Jen Easterly from CISA. We face threats at machine speed and adversaries unbounded by bureaucracy. And I think that's as good as anybody could have said it, right? We've got these artificial silos that we've built up. We've got these bureaucracies. We've got different budgets. We've got different thoughts, different skill sets, different ideas. And yet, ultimately, we're trying to do one thing. We're trying to protect the enterprise. We're trying to protect data that's been entrusted to us. And nowhere is that more important than in the national security context. And that's what CMMC 2 was about. And I think we're all trying to fight the good fight, and we all deserve better tools to do it with, better weapons. And I think we're equipping our troops in the risk management sphere and the compliance sphere and the security sphere by automating, relying on automation, making us smarter, making the world smarter, not harder. And that's what it's about. So again, I appreciate you guys being here with me, sharing your thoughts, sharing your opinions. I think it's been hugely informative. I've certainly learned a few things myself. And thank you to Caresoft for sponsoring the event. And thank you all for being here, and to our audience, we hope to see you again soon. Take care, guys.
I'd also like to say thank you to our participants, as well as our speakers, for being with us today. We hope the information you received during this webinar has been helpful to you and your organization.